One thing that I've not encountered in wine that sake does extremely well is to present something that is almost savory. There's one that I have had where it's an extremely unusual sake. It's aged for 17 years, which is almost unheard of in this day and age. And as you can imagine, that bottle was priced appropriately for that. But it was soy sauce, caramel, toasted mushrooms, and wood. And then in that same fridge next to it, I've got a bottle that when I opened it was like somebody had taken a Fuji apple and just crushed it directly into my mouth. And they're both made with the same rice from the same region of Japan with the same water.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. Okay, here we are. Same time, same channel, Decoding Cocktails. I'm Chris LeBeau. Today's episode, this is the one you didn't know you wanted that you definitely need. My guest today is Andrew Lamb. He is the owner of Highwater Sake. Who is this guy? Andrew has a long history in the culinary food and beverage space, and yet during COVID is how he came to be the owner of this. He was sitting at home and always had an affinity for Japan, especially when he was younger. But Andrew says he had a bottle of sake lying around, also talks about going to the wonderful St. Louis bar and restaurant, Indo. And when he had sake, really for the first time, kind of in his grown-up years, was like, oh my God, I need to know everything about this. And so quickly now has become a certified sake sommelier and a certified educator through the Sake Sommelier Association. That's how you say that. So sake is something, Andrew has a lovely term out there that I couldn't help but laugh at called the American Hot Sake Experience. And what you really need to know about this term is really that just most of the sake that most of us, the average one of us, has experienced is either a low quality or even with a lot of the hot sake that is typically ordered at like a happy hour or something. It is oftentimes even coming out of a machine. And this made me think about something I didn't say during the interview, which is I know one of the things that bars talk about a lot is that draft beer lines need to be cared for. Otherwise, bacteria and other things can help impact the pull of a draft beer where it's just poorer quality. Andrew says this is very much often the case with sake that is being fed out of a machine. So anyways, today's discussion is really about the fact that this long history of a product that is brewed like beer and drank like wine is often misunderstood by us, and we haven't had good quality stuff. Andrew also comes to this field with a lot of passion because it's something that can be very intimidating even if you're curious. The parts of the bottle might be written in Japanese or just frankly very difficult to pronounce and therefore intimidating. Andrew cites in terms of what one of his goals is, a line from a sake bar in New York that he loves, which is something along the lines of people need to drink more sake more irresponsibly. And while it doesn't mean you need to tie one on, what it means is let's not make it a special occasion thing. Let's try it. It's great. You know, Andrew's, one of his big pointers is, as you'll kind of come away from today's episode with, is as long as it's not coming from a large making brewery here in the U.S., as long as it's coming from a craft place in the U.S. or in Japan, very likely you're going to get a high-quality sake that's very quickly going to open your eyes to why this is different than what you've probably experienced before. There was a really beautiful moment unintentionally during the interview when I asked Andrew about sake's relationship to Japanese culture. And he just looked at me and he said, you know, I think it's pretty much impossible to separate the two. So this was a wonderful conversation that we were able to sit down and do in person. All this will be, of course, in the show notes, but check out Andrew at highwatersake, SAKE.com, or on the Instagrams at highwatersake, or you can, of course, give him a follow directly on Instagram. He is not the original, but the second D-O-double-G, so it is Lamb, L-A-M-B-D-O-double-G. So with that, my conversation with Andrew Lamb. So Andrew, I'm curious, when we start out today, can you tell me and the folks at home or on the elliptical machine right now, what is Little Rhino?
Oh gosh, so that's an old thing that I used to do on my Instagram, because when I was working at Union Loafers, a cafe here in St. Louis, there was a rhinoceros toy that got left behind by one of our tables one day, and it jokingly got put into my hands, and so I started taking pictures to post in the bakery with it, and then I took it with me on a trip to Chicago. And my mother thought that I had put it on a painting in a museum there, and then took a picture of it. And she was like, "They're going to kick you out. They're going to kick you out." And I was like, No. I didn't put it on the painting. I just was holding it next to the painting. And it turned into a long-running gag for a while, where I was talking about Little Rhino as if though it was something else, while also talking about myself as if though I was the little rhino. But honestly, I think, sitting on my computer at home on my tower, which is up on my desk next to my computer, I've got the rhino just sitting there perched looking at me at all times when I'm working. So
it's, I saw it hashtagged a number of times, and so I was like, you know what? I'm like, sometimes you just got to know a thing or two right here.
Just a dumb little bit that I did for a while for myself, just a little joke.
I mean, if life isn't here for our own personal amusement, I don't know what the heck we're doing here. So
absolutely. It took me a second when you asked that. I was like, what is Little Rhino? That's a great question. It took me a second to get back to the context of what it was and how you would know that in reference to me.
That's right. Yeah, Andrew and I have known each other for about 8 minutes now, so it's going real well. I was curious. So you and I have a kind of similar arc in a little bit of a way that, we are both now kind of, in the distilling hospitality industry. You have a longer history in it, I suppose, than I do, working in all sorts of different gigs. But this sake exploration for you really began to take its deep dive during the pandemic, as I've read. You had some sake apparently laying around at home. So is that when did your fascination with Japan and Japanese culture begin prior to the pandemic, or did you just happen to have a bottle laying around and that catalyzed it for you?
So I think it actually, my interest in Japan started when I was pretty young. There used to be this late night Cartoon Network thing called Toonami. I don't know if anybody remembers that. I'm really dating myself here. But they used to show the English dubs of anime. And so there was just this whole series of them, just old school anime, the Fooly Cooly, the Yu Yu Hakusho. I can't believe I remember their names still, but I kind of fell in love with the idea of Japan, which is not the reality of it, but the idea of it back then. And then as I grew older, I kind of had a few situations that kind of pushed me away from pursuing that interest. And then I got into cooking. And then years and years later down the line, when I was spending some time during the pandemic, doing a little soul searching like many of us did, I kind of fell into this idea of let's pursue that childhood dream. Let's do something for me. So I started to learn Japanese. And I just so happened to go out to dinner when everything started opening back up and we were allowed to and all that good stuff. I just so happened to go out to dinner at Indo and saw their sake menu and thought, you know what, I've never had a good experience with this, but I've never had a bad experience here at Indo. So I'll give it a shot. And I mean, it was like falling off a cliff. There was no going back. It was a bottle of the Montense Crane, which is just a Junmai, just a classic Junmai, and I fell in love instantly. I Started looking stuff up online, just kind of like as a fun, like, oh, maybe this will be a hobby thing for me to do, just to kind of know a little bit about this. And from there, it turned into buying some books. From there, it turned into looking into certifications, to doing certifications, to becoming an educator, to taking another certification, so forth and so on. And here we are. And honestly, all of that happened pretty quick. That's about a 1.5 to 2 year time span that I'm talking about in there. So, I kind of fell very much into the rabbit hole of things and never climbed back out.
So first off, shout out to Kira Webster and the team at Indo, soon to be Sato as well. So starting at the beginning, because probably everybody listening out there is familiar with Saké. They've had it, they've been near it, but let's start at the beginning. What exactly is Saké? Give us the high level on it.
Yeah, so Saké is a brewed beverage made from rice, water, yeast, and something called koji. Koji is an inoculated rice mold. For the science nerds out there, it's Aspergillus oryzae, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong because nobody's ever corrected me on it. But essentially, those 4 ingredients, and then sometimes they'll add in a brewer's alcohol, are used to brew something that can be incredibly delicate and lovely and delicious. We joke a lot in the industry that it's brewed like beer and drank like wine. You know, we've got this very robust brewing process that's incredibly unique, but it does produce something that's like light and lovely and sippable. You don't want to crush it like you would a beer or shoot it like you would a shot because it's not a distilled alcohol. I think typically Saké, well, I don't think I know, typically Saké lands in between the 14 to 20% range on ABV.
So, complex brewing process. So, just make sure we're always starting at the beginning. So, in order to ferment something, you need some kind of sugar that yeast wants to consume. And then I think I once heard bartender Jeffrey Morgenthaler delicately put it as yeast eats sugar and it poops out alcohol and carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's their science for the day. But so what makes this process so intricate in the brewing cycle?
Yeah. So to emphasize kind of why it's unique, I'll actually do, and to anybody that's into wine or beer listening to this, forgive me. This is a very blatant shortcoming of this explanation. But, with wine, it's very simple and straightforward. We've got grapes, which have a high natural amount of sugar in the process. We'll smash that. We'll chuck some yeast into it. And then next thing you know, we've got wine. Obviously, that's, pretty reductive of that. But same thing kind of goes for beer. With beer, we've got these malts, these grains, and what we can do is a process called germination, or in the brewing process called malting. And what you're doing is you're tricking the grain into thinking it's springtime. So what it's doing is it's taking that germ and it's telling it, hey, convert that into sugar so that we can, grow. And from there, we're yanking it out, dumping it in a different tank, putting yeast in it, beer's made. Again, very reductive. However, with Saké, the rice that we're brewing with, our primary kind of grain situation, we're not throwing in wholesale from the field. The rice goes through a polishing process, whether that's, typically Saké is going to land somewhere between 70 to below 50% polishing ratio. And what I mean by that is that that's the percentage left after polishing. So if you have a 70% polishing ratio, they've taken 30% of the grain off. And that's a very slow and long process that we can chat about in a moment. But the important thing to know is that we no longer have that germ on the rice. So if we were to cook that and throw it into a tank with yeast, the yeast doesn't have anything to eat on. It needs that sugar, right, to poop out the alcohol, as we've discussed. So what needs to happen is we need to have a second microbiome, a microbe. I don't know why I said whatever that other word was. We need to have a second microbe in there doing the work to convert starch into sugar. And that's what koji does.
Okay.
That mold gets into the rice, it eats all that starch up, and it releases sugar as a byproduct. And at the same time that's happening during the process, the yeast is eating that sugar and converting it into alcohol. It's called multiple parallel fermentation. It's the only alcohol in the world brewed this way. Fully unique, fully something that just kind of came about by happenstance, just due to the koji being a natural mold that occurs in Japanese wood. And here we are today, 1,000 years later at least, making truly incredible products, but it is unique in that way.
So to make sure, so Andrew, we take a piece of rice and we want to polish it down. Is that essentially like when we talk about like the germ or terms that I remember from biology but couldn't define? So are we polishing it down so that it makes it easier for the koji to then convert the remaining starch to sugar? Or is like what's on the outside just undesirable? So in terms of we're polishing it down to get rid of gross stuff, to get rid of, to make so we can get to the sugars in the middle. Walk me through that part right there.
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting too, because there's kind of there's broad categories of rice, but there's, as far as we're concerned for sake, there's two different categories of rice. There's table rice, which is what we're used to eating. These grains are very well balanced. They've got starch, proteins, fats all throughout, so it gives you a really nice bite. Everything is really lovely and in balance. And then there's sakamai, or sake-specific rice strains. Sake rice is not in balance for eating. What's happening with sake rice is that an ideal grain has a kind of core called the shimpaku, or the starch heart. And what we want when we're polishing is to get as close to that as possible. Depending on the style, obviously, we want some of them to have a little bit more. And the reason for that is because in brewing, those proteins, those fats, those lipids that are located kind of on the further outside of that rice, when the starch is fully concentrated in the middle, can lead to more umami, kind of oily, savory flavors. So if you're aiming for a very light, fruity, like ginjo, having more of that on there means that you're going to have a harder time getting to those light, lovely, fruity aromatics. However, if you're making something like a honjozo, which we'll be tasting a little bit later today, those aren't necessarily bad things because they're going to give you some qualities that you want. There's also some really interesting developments in rice polishing recently that I'm by no means an expert on, but it's changing the way that we polish rice in such a way that we can achieve a more fruity sake with a lower polished rice.
Okay.
But again, that's like in the last couple years, and I think as far as I'm aware, there's only like 2 or 3 breweries really actively pursuing that particular part. So it's a fun little rabbit hole to dive into, well worth looking into if you're interested in that. That's Fukucho from Imada Shuzo. I believe that Imada-san is working with the technology for that.
So as happens in every podcast episode, we will certainly have all sorts of links and show notes that I will no doubt be chasing Andrew down for, because I'm sure that as I attempt to type some of these things into browsers, I will fail epically. But that will be okay. We will get that all straightened out so that you guys can follow along with various links and not. Part of with my love for rum, we have the idea that I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, their rum experience is Malibu or Captain Morgan or whatever. And for a number of folks out there listening, you know, even if it hasn't been for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years or whatever, you know, I feel like the layperson listening, their experience with sake has probably either been, oh, they were out for sushi and like someone had it on a happy hour special, or heaven forbid, late night, they were having sake bombs. Tell us about when we're likely drinking sake on happy hour, or God forbid, we've been sucked into the sake bomb like wormhole. I don't know. Maybe there's a dignified way to do them. But tell us about what people probably have experienced when they're drinking on the lower end of sake.
Yeah, absolutely. So the lower end of sake is, in Japan, it would be called something called futsushu. Futsu means regular, shu means alcohol. And the reason that that's important is because most of the premium stuff that people like me end up talking about a lot is actually legally a different category of sake. So it's also worth noting that sake is the Japanese word for alcohol. So in Japan, it's called something very different. If you ask for sake, you might get a beer, you might get a shot of whiskey, or you might get sake. But in America, it's what I refer to as the hot sake, the American hot sake experience. Typically what you're getting is something that has been brewed here in the States using pretty lax rules. To my knowledge, there's no federal law or language around Nihonshu or Seishu, which is what sake is called in Japan, which means that the breweries here in America can make pretty much whatever they want to make, so long as it kind of falls within the category of sake. Now, I'm not saying that they are, pouring straight ethanol with some sugar into a bottle. But I also don't know what's in that bottle. And, to be clear, these are, I don't know if maybe we'll cut this part out, but these are brands like Ozeki, Gekikan, Shochikubai. There's a place for them. I don't want them to go away, but I wouldn't drink them. They exist for a reason.
Right.
And so typically when you're getting that, when you order just like a hot sake at a restaurant, you're getting it out of a machine that has a big kind of bladder box full of the cheap stuff that comes from one of these breweries. And then another thing that I think people don't want to acknowledge, but I fully will say it, those machines are hard to clean, and most people don't clean them.
Right.
Ever. And that's nasty. And so you're getting something that is not a great product to start with, and then you're getting it that's been pushed through a machine that likely has mold growing on the inside and has bacteria and other nasty stuff, and it's getting heated up. So you're drinking hot, moldy alcohol.
Say more.
Yeah, and it's usually a little too hot. So you end up getting what most people identify for sake being this like hot, sticky, sweet, burny, boozy liquid, and they think that's not for me.
Right.
Which, yeah, me neither. I don't want to drink that either. There's some really great stuff out there, and one of my true delights is getting to kind of break that first sip barrier on somebody that's only ever had the hot sake experience. And again, I want to, sorry to dogleg here, but hot sake is delightful. It can be truly lovely. It's specifically what I'm calling the American hot sake experience that I'm referring to here. But when you get to have somebody have that first sip of something that is carefully made by somebody that loves what they're doing and has a lot of care and practice and tradition built behind what they're doing, you really get to see people kind of light up and go, oh my God, that's good. And it really is one of the greatest moments in my kind of day-to-day life is getting to pour that little sip and getting that experience. Have you had that experience yet?
So yeah, actually, probably here and there, but what resonates most with me is I remember it was about June of last year. My brother lives out in Denver, Colorado, and I went out to a little joint for happy hour, and they had a whole array of it, and our server was super excited and enthusiastic, and we definitely had like a nice flight come out, and it was delightful, and certainly one of those moments where I'm sure my mind was open to it before then, but I was like, oh yeah, this is freaking great. So, and for me, using the thing, like in this, here blows my sponsorship chance with Bacardi, but like giving somebody a chance to have a daiquiri crafted with something like a plantation rum compared to Bacardi, it's like Bacardi is designed, and to your point about Gekikan and some of these other brands, Bacardi has a time and a place. It's designed to compete with vodka in the rum category. But when somebody has a plantation 3 stars, they go, holy shit, like this is super flavorful. What don't I know about rum? And the answer is probably a lot. And so I think seeing people's brain kick on in that way is always, it's a pretty interesting, special moment, I would say.
It is funny that we keep talking about rum a little bit too, because it really kind of, I think, rum was one of my first lead-ins to thinking about alcohol as more than just a means to get drunk. And so it is funny that you talk about having this kind of relationship with it, because I remember my first time that somebody gave me a bottle of I think it was a Florida Cana. Mm-hmm. And, up until that point I had like Kraken and, the plastic bottle stuff. And I remember being like, wow, this isn't spiced or sweet. This is crap. And then drinking it again over ice. And then, just repeatedly, just because I was like, well, I'm not going to not drink this bottle.
Right.
And just by the end of it, I was like, I don't know what I'm tasting or what I'm getting, but I get it. I just don't know what I get. And I think that a lot of people have that same reaction to a lot of things. With wine, we're all kind of a little bit desensitized to it because we're so used to seeing wine lists and hearing French words or Italian words or German words surrounding wine. And to some extent beer too. I mean, most people fundamentally understand what a lager is without you having to explain, like, oh, well, it's a cold fermentation where the yeast sits at this particular part of the tank. I bet most people couldn't even tell you that. And saying that out loud, I actually refrained from saying where the yeast was because I don't remember.
Sure.
So I think I don't remember where I started with this, so I apologize about that. Oh, talking about kind of the thing is that it can be really scary on a menu when you're looking at a whole kind of beverage list and you see, you've got your beers that you're familiar with. You know what a stout is, you know what a porter, you know the lager, the ale. And then the next category is going to be your cocktails, and you know what a gin and tonic is going to taste like. And then you see your wine list, and you've got that super buttery California Chardonnay and that super light and mineral dry kind of Italian white. And then you get down to the bottom and you see a page that says things like Tokubetsu Junmai made with Gyohyaku Mangoku rice from Niigata Prefecture. You're like, what does that mean?
Right.
And a lot of places, I think I am excited that you got to have that experience in Denver where you had somebody that was excited to guide you through the category, but a lot of people don't know what they're selling, and it's something that the owner either thinks that they should have or that they want, but they don't go through the effort of, educating their staff. And again, this is not me kind of trying to down on anybody, but it really takes a lot of work to get people through that door and to get them to accept it. And then once they do, they really enjoy it, and it's still hard to keep them there because they can't pronounce the words, and it's stressful to sit in a restaurant and look at somebody that knows the actual word and to try to say it to them. And so my main goal with all of this is to try to make it approachable and fun and easy. There's this great bar in New York called Accidental Bar. Shout out to those guys doing fantastic work. And one of my favorite things about this place is up on the wall, they've got this like chalkboard that has quotes written on it. And the quote that I love the most off of it is the owner saying, I want more people to drink more sake more irresponsibly. And he's not saying I want people to get like fucked up every day. He's saying I want it to be a household beverage. I want it to be something where you're sitting at home and you're like, ooh, I want a little drink. It's the end of the day. You want to reach for something. We want that to be something where you're thinking about sake on the same level that you are a beer or a wine, where it's something where you're comfortable reaching into your fridge, popping out, and just pouring yourself a glass and sitting on the couch. And I think we can get there. I don't remember where that started. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. I like that because while unlike beer, wine, and sake, I tend to sometimes talk about cocktails this way, and it's like, listen, like a simple cocktail costs you a couple bucks to make, and the reality is like, stop thinking when things are special, too special, they're coveted and reserved for special situations. And I'm like, listen, you need a delicious ordinary cocktail all the time, and it's affordable enough that you can afford to mess it up.
To that point too, I think that you mentioned that most people have kind of those two experiences of the sake bomb or the happy hour. But I think too, another experience that I find that I hear a lot is we went to Japan and we had this really great meal and we had this delicious sake over there. And the problem with that is, one, I'm jealous of it, and two, it becomes enshrined in this like memory, in this perfect point in time, and they're unwilling to risk that memory. And I'm here to tell you that you can have that experience here in the States just as easily, both domestic and foreign sake that comes in. Typically, you're going to find that places that have a large sake menu that know what they're talking about are huge nerds, and they're taking very good care of the product. And as a result, it's going to be just as good as something you had over there.
I think, to your point, yeah, like travel, these life-changing experience, these romantic settings are lovely, but you are right that I had this cocktail, to my little world, at this bar in New York or Italy, and you could never have that anywhere else. And it's like, no, that's actually probably not true. So much of it is the moment and the memory. And that's great. Don't take that away from yourself. But objectively, you can still have a pretty darn good cocktail away from that place. And don't lose the magic of that world in Japan that you captured there. But there's a way that you can. There's also a way. Remember another rum line. Recently spoke with rum ambassador Adrienne Stoner from Plantation. Shout out to them again. But anyways, she talked about how transportive she feels rum is. And so if anything, to someone out there who had that experience in Japan, allow that sake to take you back there in a very small way too.
Absolutely. And kind of to add to that, the idea of like the cocktail that's very easy. Sake is also there's a big push to acknowledge sake as a cocktail ingredient, and that's a kind of a big thing in Japan, and it's definitely a big thing here. And I think it makes it a lot more approachable for people too. Our common touch point, Kira Webster, who's a genius, she made this corpse reviver where she used this super savory kind of funky little aged sake as the base, and then instead of doing an absinthe spritz over the top, she did this like ginger shochu spritz over the top. And it was probably my favorite version of that drink that I've ever had. And I'm biased towards it because of the sake going on in there. But
of course.
Of course, Kira made it, so it's the best version of that possible thing. But truly, there's really, I would encourage people to explore it and to not be afraid of it. If you see made in the USA on the bottle and it's not a craft brewery, just don't pick that bottle up, and you're probably going to have a good time with whatever you end up picking up.
Yeah, so to that point where maybe it's useful to go now, because, it's interesting, Andrew, I think we can look at rice, and we see this seemingly ordinary, boring in our mind commodity grain or whatever. But in terms of the spectrum of flavors that we can encounter, I'm sure I'm supposed to ask what there's like a sweetness scale, SMV or something like that.
Yeah, the sake meter value.
Yeah, but I'd be interested right now if you wouldn't mind talking about kind of the spectrum of flavor that we might encounter in sake, and of course this spectrum of dryness to sweetness, because I think for many people it's just like, trying to even begin to think about it like a wine or a beer. It's like, oh, but those come from fancy grapes, and that's different. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so to some extent, that's definitely a consideration. The rice is, of course, very important, as is the water, as is the yeast, as is the koji. But one of the things that we talk about, too, when we're teaching people kind of how to think about sake is that in beer, a lot of the flavor is going to come from your grains and your hops. They kind of are the driving factor of where your flavor is going to be. Obviously, the brewer has a lot of choice in any alcohol. Same for any distiller. You have a lot of choices to make. With wine, you're never going to make a Pinot Noir grape taste like a super buttery Chardonnay. And I cannot wait for somebody to come and be like, "Nuh-uh," and show me that I'm wrong. But in sake, there's really so many choices to be made in the process. They say that there's 10,000 choices. It's this idea of banryu, it's called, that the brewer makes during the process. And the flavor exists in those choices. So when we're talking flavors of sake, one thing to keep in mind is that sake has about 5 times less things like citric acid or those really punchy acids that wine does, but it does have significantly more, up to 10 times more amino and like umami acids going on in there. So you're still able to get a huge range, but we're not looking at the difference between like a super jammy tannic red to a super fruity, dry, mineral-driven white. We're looking more at the difference between levels of fruit. We're looking at different, is it tropical fruit? Does it have apple? Are we looking at white fruit? Are we looking at kind of soft, subtle notes of cereal grains? Are we looking at soy sauce, mushroom? One thing that I've not encountered in wine that sake does extremely well is to present something that is almost savory. There's one that I have had where it's an extremely unusual sake. It's aged for 17 years, which is almost unheard of in this day and age. And as you can imagine, that bottle was priced appropriately for that. But it was soy sauce, caramel, toasted mushrooms, and wood. And then in that same fridge next to it, I've got a bottle that when I opened it was like somebody had taken a Fuji apple and just crushed it directly into my mouth. And they're both made with the same rice from the same region of Japan with the same water. And it's all in the choices that the brewers made to get this super funky aged guy and this super light floral fruity guy. rice definitely has a huge play in that. There's over 120 varieties of sake-specific rice strains. And then sake can be brewed with table rice as well. So we're not limited to only those strains. However, if we look at some of the kind of most common strains, things like Yamada Nishiki, which is referred to as the king of sake rice, Yamada Nishiki is very well known for its light, floral, fruity qualities. A lot of this is obviously dependent on the koji and the yeast used, but typically when you see Yamada Nishiki and it's a ginjo, you kind of have some idea of what to expect going into it. If you see something that says omachi is a kind of actually it's the only naturally occurring like wild rice strain that is in sake. Everything else has been kind of developed to have certain favorable qualities. But omachi has more of this like round, rustic, and earthy flavor to it. And it's actually got a huge cult following. They call themselves the Omachists, which is one of my favorite sake rice facts. And then, we can go even further. So there's specific strains from specific parts of the country. Dewa Sansan is known for its extremely light and floral flavor. Gohyakumangoku is known for being a hardier, sturdier grain. And it goes on and on and on. I could spend, a while trying to struggle to remember all of my rice grains off the top of my head.
Sure.
And just say a bunch of Japanese words that people don't know. But it really does come down to that. Like, there's so many different tools for us to pull when we're brewing sake that you really get this really fun difference. And some of it isn't in the rice. Some of it is in the water. Some of it is in the yeast choice. There's this yeast out there called Cell 24. Cell 24 has the highest concentration of isoamyl acetate, which is the ester or aroma of apple. So it's just this incredibly appley, almost unbearably appley glass of sake. It's almost overwhelming, and it kind of destroys your palate for everything following it. And then there are strains of yeast that down in Kochi Prefecture, which is way down in the south of Japan, they've sent these strains of yeast out to space and then brought them down to see what the radiation would do to them. I've not had those because it's an extremely limited run and those sell out instantly, but it's really fascinating what's out there. So all of these things kind of come together. And then we've got to think, too, the water situation in Japan is very varied. Water in one part of a town even, there's this brewing neighborhood in the Nara-Gogo region, which is in Hyogo. And there's a whole bunch of breweries all on the same street. And if you test the water at the top of the street and test the water at the end of the street, you'll have different mineral breakdowns because it's run through that pipe to get all the way down there. So when you're talking about how does the hardness of water affect sake, it's extremely important. And so a brewery that could use the same exact rice, the same exact brewing method, even the same exact brewer, could make brewery at these two different breweries that are a mile and a half away from each other. Mm-hmm. And you'll have two very different sakes because the water affected it or the microclimate of the space affected it.
Right.
And so that's kind of when we talk about the skill of the toji or the skill of the brewmaster, because it is so important to the flavor of sake. And I've completely gone off the point of this, which is to kind of talk about the flavors in sake. Typically, we expect to see things like honeydew melon, banana, apple, tropical fruits are very common. We see a lot of cereal grains. So if you've ever popped your head over the rice cooker, when you pop it open and get that big old cloud of steam, that kind of slightly sweet, toasty grain smell, that's a very common flavor as well. That rice, mushrooms, soy sauce on the funkier side of things, caramel, kind of burnt honey. All of these are experiences that I've had. Sometimes you get kumquat, peach. So it's a really fun category. The one that we're tasting today, I get this salted melon out of. I actually have two, but the one that's a fresh bottle for us to taste from today is big, summer beach vibes to me.
Wow. For the record, that's the first time anybody said isoamyl acetate on this podcast, I think. But that was, assuming I even...
No, you nailed it. And now I'm actually going to quickly double check because there's another one too that is the banana ester.
Andrew came prepared with all of his books and everything. It's great.
I've got quite a few.
So where I let's see, what was I? Yeah, and so first, as I kind of recollect my thoughts here, I think it's, for people out there listening and you haven't heard, you haven't experienced sake with some of these flavors that Andrew's rattling off. It's a great, call to like, okay, maybe it's time for us to go back and give sake a look. And so we will certainly, obviously, today and in the show notes have a couple of brands and good places to start. I've also seen him talk before. Obviously, much like with a lot of things, going to the right retailer is the useful thing too of like, what people want to know in those situations, like in a restaurant is, sure, you want the perfect thing, but what you really want to know is like, I want to make a decision that I'm not going to like regret, right? Like, I don't want to look like an idiot and like get me something that's going to be interesting because, you got your place you like to go with all your whiskey or rum drinking friends, beer drinking friends, and you roll in with a bottle of sake feeling confident to say, hey, this is going to be interesting. That's it's a pretty powerful thing right there, I'd say.
Yeah, and so I think on that note of like a retailer, I think you'll have some luck looking into local wine stores. I find that the natural wine crowd is very into sake. Beer guys also tend to get it pretty quickly as well because it is a very interesting and you can see a lot of parallel vibes. If you have the luxury of living in a place like New York, you can always go to Bin Bin Sake or Kuraichi. If you live in California, you've got basically the whole world in your hand. You've got True Sake. Up in Portland, my good friend Nina Murphy and her shop, Sunflower Sake. She's doing incredible work up there. Shout out to Nina Murphy. But, for those of us kind of everywhere else in the country, I find that it can be a little bit challenging. And a lot of times what you'll see on online forums, like the Sake Reddit page, you'll see a common post there. Somebody's just taking a bunch of pictures of a liquor store shelf, and they're like, which one should I get?
Right.
Right. Because there's not much guidance. And so one thing that I would encourage people to do is there's great online retailers. True Sake out of California, they do online retailing. There's a website called Tipsy, TIPPSY.com. I'm not an affiliate or anything. I just like what they do, and I do write for them. But they have got truly probably one of the most comprehensive beginner guides and definitely the most comprehensive way to search for sake. So if you kind of are like, I don't know what I like, I have no idea what to get at the shelf, and you go, oh, wait, I've had that one before. I'll look it up on Tipsy real quick. Oh, it says that it's a light and dry category. Well, let's quickly look at the other light and dry category and see if these bottles make sense. Mm-hmm. Or just order from them. I mean, they do great work as well. So there's definitely resources out there. And I think it's just like, if I were to walk into a wine store, I wouldn't really know what to pick up because there's so many choices. It's the same situation. You're probably going to pull your phone out or you're probably going to grab somebody and ask them. And if the store person doesn't know, which they probably don't be afraid to go to the internet. There's tons of resources and there's tons of people like me who want to tell you what's good and what you should enjoy and what to avoid.
Yeah, and you hit on this earlier when we were talking about, sorry, there goes our GigaCon sponsorship. But when people are in the store, Andrew, and we said like, hey, there's obviously a time and place for everything. Like there's a market for Milwaukee's best beer and it's just not with me. But did you say that there are certain words or directional musings people should kind of look out for? Like if okay, let me make sure other than price point, right? You see sake and it's like $2.99 or whatever the heck. It's probably not an indication of quality, but anything you would be looking for on a label or missing from a label that helps you know like probably not the best investment of my money.
I think that can be challenging to do just because while I'll say this, I have yet to meet a label on a bottle from Japan that I haven't thought was pure artwork because they really do put a lot of care and effort into it. So if it's an ugly bottle, I guess maybe that's an indicator. But if you spin that bottle around and try to look at the back label and you see the words made in the USA and it's not from a craft brewery, you're probably going to have something that's not going to be super pleasant. As far as price point goes as well, I have found that a lot of times, if we're looking at the 300 milliliter, which is the smaller bottles that you'll see in stores, those typically, if you're somewhere in that kind of $12 to $20 range, you're probably getting something pretty decent.
Okay.
That may not always be true depending on pricing and regional stuff like that. In the larger bottle size, I find that a retail range of kind of that 25 to 45, you're going to be landing with some pretty nice stuff. I think the one that I have today, retail-wise, sits somewhere in that 28 to 35 range.
Okay.
That said, obviously we can get pretty crazy out there. There's a bottle that comes here into St. Louis that I've yet to see in a store, but if you were to retail price, it would probably sit around $200.
Okay.
And there's reasons for that. It's not just, that's another great thing too that I like to mention when I'm talking about pricing for sake. Sake is not reliant on some tradition or knowing the brewery to price their product. They're pricing their product based on the labor, the materials, the effort of shipping it to the States, the effort of storing it. It's not going to be like a Dom Perignon where, sure, you're paying for quality, but you're also paying because that's a bottle of Dom Perignon.
Right.
They understand that they don't have that kind of push here in the States. And there are bottles that have that situation. You'll see the Desai 23, and that's a very expensive bottle, but it is also a 23% polishing ratio, which means that before even getting to the brewing process, before any of the loss that's involved with straining or filtering or anything else, they have thrown away 77% of the grain is gone before they're even starting.
Right.
So when you think about that, they need almost quadruple the amount of rice to make the same size batch. So that's why that bottle's more expensive. And that's pretty standard across the thing. You're going to see things that have lower polishing ratios are a little bit more expensive. Sometimes things with higher polishing ratios are also expensive, and there's typically reasons. They're either using a more boutique rice, or it's being refrigerated from brewery to bottle shelf. Things that are fully unpasteurized are going to be a little bit more expensive because it's a lot harder to move those around and make sure that they stay shelf stable. And then you've got to think too, I've been talking about sake rice as though it's this huge thing, but really there's a very limited amount grown every year, and breweries want to get at it. And so you get into these situations where there's specific fields in Japan behind the Roko mountain range down in the south called the Tokuei Yamada Nishiki fields. And if I were to open up a brewery here and produce something truly amazing in my first brew and then go to those guys and be like, great, now I'll buy your rice, they'd be like, get the hell out of here, because they've already got contracts with all of these breweries. They don't have a relationship with me. So a lot of times too, the rice is coming from farmers that have long-standing relationships with these breweries. And unlike wine, there was a law a while back, and I don't remember the exact dates that it was put in place or taken away, but there was a time where brewers were not allowed to brew their own rice. You had to purchase it from a farmer. And then, we start getting into kind of the socio-political, economic side of Japan here, where you're looking at sake as a modern industry has changed very dramatically since the 60s. In the 60s, they couldn't make the kind of sake that they can make today by law. It had to be fortified to a certain percentage. You couldn't use certain rice. You couldn't, if it could be a table eating rice, you typically weren't using that for sake because they needed it for food during the war. So things really started to change around the 80s. And so I think of it as this really interesting juxtaposition of having this 1,000-year tradition of brewing with about 80 years of real innovative work that have changed it. And that, again, this is not to say that there isn't other things that go into it. There's a huge history of all of the developments, and it's super fascinating. But I don't even remember where I started on this train again. I do this all the time.
You know what? You're welcome to my world. So I think, in a way, I'm also interested in, when you talk about sake being this, thing of 10,000 decisions, I think about, so much of Japanese culture being so intricate and nuanced. So are there ways, and I don't know if this is easy to summarize or if it's even a good question, but are there ways in which, in your mind, that sake is a good representation of Japanese culture? How would you think about that question?
I think it's impossible to separate sake and Japanese culture. I think that those two are so intricately bound up together that if you were to try to look at Japanese culture as a whole and present it to somebody that didn't know anything about Japan and you didn't mention sake, you would be missing out on a section of what they're doing. So to give an example for that, sake is historically used in Shinto ceremonies. Shinto is kind of the reverence of the natural world, spirits and everything, and kind of a thoughtfulness about it. But they'll pour out little cups of sake and put it on these shrines to these spirits as a way to honor them and to kind of ask for their favor. In weddings, there's a ceremony called Sansan Kudo. It's an incredibly traditional Japanese wedding ceremony. And essentially what they do is they've got these three cups, these three very small cups that you kind of super shallow and wide. You have to hold it with both hands so you don't spill it. And what they'll do is they'll pour a little bit of sake into the smallest cup. The bride will take 3 sips, hand it to the husband. The husband will take 3 sips. And then they do it again for each of the 3 cups. It means 3, 3, 3 times. And so it's just this kind of wrapped up thing. You can look at almost any aspect of Japanese culture and find some way in which sake has touched or influenced it. If you're a Japanese salaryman, you're going on nomikais, which are drinking parties after work with your colleagues, or you're drinking beer and then sake. Well, that's a way to break down those cultural walls between your higher-ups and you so that you can actually talk to your boss and they can talk to you without breaking the social contract. There's a history where you look at why Buddhism fell in Japan. There used to be these huge Buddhist warrior monk temples. Well, they paid for the way that they lived by brewing sake. And the Japanese government didn't love that they had these massive economic military powerhouses, so they took away sake brewing. And then the money dried up a little bit. It became less lucrative to become a monk, and we see sake breweries spread across the country in that way. I think at one point there was something like 13,000 breweries in Japan, and that ranged from people who were making a barrel a year in their back shed to barrel breweries that are producing massive quantities. So it's way down now. I think it's actually even more than that because it's 1,300 brewing licenses issued now, and I think it was something like 100 times that. It was insane. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but that decline does not mean that there's less sake. It means that there's less bad sake, or less just random people who just so happen to have a friend who got them a license so that they could make their hooch in the backyard.
Right. So maybe this could actually be an interesting time for our tasting that we want to do today, being that you have achieved your, we're breaking bottles out now, so you're going to hear things clanking around, and that's okay. It's fine. This is a podcast with 2 humans. So you decided amongst all of this right here, this kind of diving into stuff during COVID, during the pandemic in particular, to kind of really jump in, full bore with this. So, and in any order, and don't let yourself get lost here, but so I'd love to hear about the sake sommelier certification you've received, what that entails, and turn on your som hat now. I'm here.
I'd love to, but first, a little pouring ASMR.
That's right.
We love that. They do that on almost every sake podcast I listen to.
Well,
one more time. Why not? What a thrilling sound.
That's right. Oh, man, it's too bad you're not here right now.
You should also take a look at this. I find that the closures on sake bottles are really fascinating. They've got, instead of this cork, they'll do this plastic topper with a foil cap because we don't need to keep oxygen out. And we can talk a little bit later on about the sturdiness of sake. But it's just a totally unique little capper that goes on the bottles here. So just so that you all know that what we're tasting while I talk about this, we are sipping on the Tensei Infinite Summer. This is a sake out of Kanagawa Prefecture made with Gohyaku Mangoku rice. It's a Tokubetsu Honjozo. It's a lot of Japanese words. Tokubetsu means special process. Honjozo means alcohol added. So this rice has been polished down to probably a little bit lower based on the Tokubetsu. That special process is going to be a lower polishing ratio. I don't have that to hand right now. But it's a lower polishing ratio. And then Honjozo means that there's a little bit of brewer's alcohol added here to really smooth, round, and make things a little bit softer. This one's going to be a little bit more on the kind of drier side as well.
Okay.
Beautiful nose. Get a little apple off the nose there. A little saltiness to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Nice.
Delicious.
Yep, nice little fruit note right there. And yeah, like, I mean, with some of the ways you were talking about it, and I feel like, I feel like I've seen sake, and obviously there's a broad spectrum of it, but I feel like I've seen some sake listed at times in like martini specs and whatnot. And sometimes when you're talking about kind of like, you know, salty dryness or whatever, and especially as we talk about it being fortified a little bit too. And I mean, you said it's usually the proofing is 14 to 20%. Is that what you said typically?
Yeah, typically speaking. It's going to fall a little bit higher than wine because of that process in the brewing. But it can't go above, I believe 20% is the legal cutoff to be sake.
Okay, got it. So yeah, in terms of sturdiness, why don't we get that out of the way? Right. So I go out and I buy a bottle of sake. Once, maybe it's sitting on my shelf, unrefrigerated, but when it's open, refrigerated, talk to us about shelf life, open, unopened. How do we think about like keeping a bottle around the house?
Yeah. So first off, I would always encourage you to store your sake in the refrigerator. Sake, much like any other alcohol, is going to thrive, much like any other brewed alcohol, I should say, is going to thrive well in a cold, dark place. Now, it doesn't have to be a 30-degree cold, dark place. It could easily be something around, 50, 55 degrees. I keep most of my sake in a wine fridge that sits around, I believe, 46 degrees. And it's somewhere where there's not a lot of natural light hitting those bottles. You can store sake in a fridge for quite some time. Typically, I hear a lot of people say that you want to get to it at most a year from when the brewery released it. And you'll see, if you look at bottles, you'll often see a date down at the bottom there.
So it looks like this guy, we've got an April of 22 bottle right here. Yep.
Yeah, so we're getting to it kind of towards that end of that year mark, but
we're going to finish it right now. So
it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
But it's still very good that way. In that way, sake is very sturdy. Now, there are some, there's a brewery called Tamagawa, run by a guy named Philip Harper. He was the first non-Japanese brewmaster in Japan, to my knowledge. Don't quote me on that, or do, and then maybe be wrong. But he makes sake that people refer to as indestructible. And what he means by that is that you can sit it on your countertop, you can pop it open, you can do whatever you want to it, and it's still going to be good, if not better than when he released it. There are some brands out there, some styles that I would certainly agree with for that. I've had some of his stuff that's been open for a year and a half, and it's great. Bo Timken, the owner of True Sake, aged a bottle of his sake in a tree in the backyard of the store for a year and a half. So to give you an idea, there's, kind of a crazy spectrum. But for most of us, when you buy that bottle of sake, pop it in your fridge or keep it somewhere cool and dark. And then when you open it, keep it in your fridge, and you've got somewhere between, if it's a super fruity kind of like daiginjo, that super light, fruity, floral style, I'd say try to get to it within 2 weeks. If you've got something like what we're drinking today, this Tokubetsu Honjozo, I'd say we probably have about a month or so before some of the more kind of lovely melon and apple notes we're tasting are going to go away. So we do have some time. There are also sakes that are a little bit more sturdy, a little bit more umami driven, that do extremely well open and just kind of hanging out.
Got it.
I've got some bottles that I opened and didn't really love, and then a week or two later I went back to them, and just due to the oxidization that happened to them, I found them to be a little bit lighter, a little bit more lovely, and much more drinkable. So sake is a sturdy beverage. Unlike wine, where you're going to pop that bottle and you've got to get to it in the next day or two, you can pop a bottle of sake and you've got about a month, I would say, is a safe kind of generalization.
I'm not the world's foremost wine expert, but I feel like for something that has these kind of fruity notes, definitely like a minerality or saltiness, I feel like if you handed someone a glass of this in a wine glass and posited it as some kind, I think people would go for it in terms of that. All that to say, for people out there remembering some nightmare, unpleasant, like hot sake, stupid sake bomb, whatever experience, this very much just reminds me of the experience I had in Colorado, that this is extremely pleasant. The bottle is, not surprisingly, beautiful to look at from right here. And so, in terms of, feeling like you're in a world where, okay, we're going to do, like, because we've all been there, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to do this thing, like you're like girding yourself, like, and then you, because like, okay, we're going to hit this hard party thing or whatever. Very delicate, very easy to drink. So I think it's the kind of thing that with the right product in hand, you're going to be like, oh, this is actually really lovely. So
I joke a lot too. It's like, imagine that you sat down at a restaurant and you ordered yourself a Busch and then a Pinot Noir, and you slammed the Pinot Noir and then you took a sip of the Busch. Like, people are going to look at you like you're out of your damn mind. And that's kind of how I look at people that want to do sake bombs, which, there's a place for them. I'm not saying that they don't belong in the world. I think it's a fun way to, smash some sake. And if that's what you got to do, it's what you got to do.
Right.
But, it's like doing a shot of wine. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you really start to understand what you're doing.
And I think it really reflects two things, I think, for the most part, right? Like, it's not, this is not an anti-sake bomb thing. It's more like, one, shooting almost anything to some degree is not necessarily always comfortable. And second, what we're shooting is often lower quality, not always, right? Like, you do a tequila shot of Cuervo, God forbid, like the gold shit or whatever. But anyway, so you're doing a shot of, God, somebody bought me a crappy shot of tequila a couple weeks ago. Shout out to the Lazy Tiger team, and it was hellacious. But you shoot like this really bad stuff, and then you give people these wonderful sipping tequilas and mezcals, and it's like, oh my, like, why would you shoot this? Because like, I want to savor this. And so, that's my diatribe on sake bombs. Do them, but know that most of the time what you're probably doing them with is not good stuff and is probably not implanting good memories for what this category could be going forward.
Also, I don't think I've ever gotten done with a sake bomb or anything of that sort and been like, man, that was delicious.
or also, that was a great idea.
Right.
And, and maybe it's furthering on a mood you're in, whatever. But yeah.
It can be fun, but you're not having fun because of what you're drinking. You're having fun because there's a bunch of other idiots doing it with you, probably.
That's
Which
right.
is not to say that you're an idiot, just that we're all idiots in some ways.
Yeah, we're all best when we're surrounded by the idiots we love.
Yeah.
But,
But diving back to what you asked me before we kind of did the little pouring and all that. So when we're talking about sake certifications, we're really looking at kind of an interesting setup where, unlike wine, where you've got the Court of Master Somms or the WSET, which is the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, you've got a bunch of different boards. And, in beer, you've got Cicerone and things like that. With sake, there's not kind of a centrally, like, everyone knows that this is the authority that you go to. The WSET does have two different levels. They've got a level 1 and a level 3. I think of those kind of when you're looking at the equivalents to a wine sommelier. You've got your level 1, which is your level 1 wine somm, and your level 3, which is your level 2 wine somm. I am certified through the Sake Sommelier Association out of the UK. They are the oldest international body doing education on sake. It's a little bit less technically focused and a little bit more focused on the practical service aspects of it. Obviously, we know the technical stuff. We go through all of that. But when we're talking about what it means to be a certified sake sommelier, we are talking about how do we talk about it to guests? How do we introduce people to this category and get people drinking them and excited about it and kind of making it approachable and a little bit more fun? I find that when you bombard people with the technical facts, you're kind of losing them immediately. You can watch people gloss over. Sometimes I'll do it when I'm doing a lecture on sake just to get a little kick out of it for myself. And I'll be like, just kidding, let's back up. There's also programs out there such as the Japanese Sake diploma, so the JSA diploma. There is the Kikizake-shi, which is the Japan sommelier accreditation. And then I have taken an additional course called the Sake Scholar course by a gentleman named Michael Tremblay. And I hope I'm not saying that wrong. I apologize if I am, Michael, if you're listening to this. But Michael is a sake samurai, which is not just something that people call themselves. That is a actual thing that the brewing kind of governing body in Japan awards to people who do excellent work in kind of bringing forward the industry as a whole. It's an incredibly prestigious award. There's only 7 or so awarded a year, and Americans typically are pretty low on the list of people that get tapped for that. So Michael, and he's Canadian, but Canadians in America, it's irrelevant. Michael Tremblay is a sake samurai, and he's put together a course that studies the idea of regionality, and you could say terroir, but it is an interesting course in that you kind of land in this, is it real, is it not real in sake? And I think the best answer is, how much do you want to fight? Because some people will argue, well, it can't be real. Some people will argue that it absolutely is. But what his course really is looking at is, why is a Kanagawa sake going to have certain notes that are common throughout that entire region, whereas a Niigata sake is known for this particular thing? Or if we're looking at Kochi, why is the Kochi sake a specific way? And so he's looking at things like minerality, water, and I would equate this to being about a level 3 wine somm, kind of your advanced somm deal. Truly an incredible class. It is also one of those things where you have to have one of the other certifications to take it and really dive in. And then you've got gentlemen like John Gauntner in Japan, who is teaching his sake professional courses. He's got multiple levels: the certified sake professional, advanced sake professional. I don't know if he has a master one, but John Gauntner is kind of the English voice in sake. He's been doing it longer than everybody else. He knows more people in the industry than anybody else, and he's seen more of it than anybody else as far as the English-speaking industry is concerned. So getting to take his classes are kind of like a big gold star on your resume.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So with all of that, obviously now you've turned around and created High Water Sake. So how do you, for the people that you're often working with and coaching through on these things like that, we've obviously just spent a nice little bit of time kind of talking this, but what might someone expect if they're coming to a course that you're kind of rolling out for them? What might they get into?
Yeah, so I have a couple different levels of coursing that I go through. I've got kind of a very casual setup, which I've done in people's homes, where it's just kind of, hey, we're going to get together, we're going to taste through a bunch of stuff. I'll tell you a little bit about what this is and kind of run you through kind of the basics of it. We'll talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll kind of drink a bunch of sake and have a good time. And it's pretty casual and laid back. I'm not too focused on making sure that they've got the schoolboy details down. And then it goes all the way up to the certification level courses, where it is still meant to be fun. I don't ever want anybody to come into my classroom or into any lecture or anything that I'm doing really and be like, man, that was kind of boring. I want it to be fun. I want it to be engaging. But when you're talking a certification, it is a certification, and there is, a certain amount of retention that we expect. So I always try to cater what I'm teaching to the particular class. If it is something super casual, I'll get the details out. If people have questions, I'm happy to dive deeper into any particular thing. But I'm typically kind of doing a quick service overview, because again, most of the times you're teaching people something new, and if you try to dive all the way to the bottom of the pool, they're going to get lost and they're going to forget some stuff, or they're going to think that some things are more important than they necessarily need to be. However, if we're teaching somebody to be a sommelier, if you're getting to that certified sommelier level, we do need to kind of make sure that we've got it locked down and that you do understand the difference between things like Tsukihase and Sohase and what that even means.
Don't we all?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's little details that I will often jokingly tell to my sommeliers, like, this is going to be something that you're never going to say out loud when talking to a client or a guest, but you have to know them. Because if you don't know it, you can't talk about it if it does come up. So that's kind of where I think of it on the scale. There's a super casual where I want you to be comfortable walking into a liquor store and looking at a bottle and being like, oh, I know the words on there. I know what a Tokubetsu Junmai is. But then I also want people to be at the point where they could have this level of conversation where you're kind of purposefully having to hold yourself back from talking about more things, because it's, as we've done several times already, just leads into total rabbit trails that are irrelevant to the original question.
But so often they're where the real meat of everything is. And I think, if I remember correctly, when we kind of were like scheduling this, so first we were talking, and we'll have a link to this, but coincidentally to like today's conversation, unfortunately this probably won't come out until early April, so hello, April. But anyways, I feel like I remember, yesterday the New York Times ran a piece on the emerging sake boom, and sorry to say this, New York and California, tough luck, but apparently the future of American sake production is going to be here in the Midwest, in the state of Arkansas, which grows most of our rice. But in terms of things coming up, do I remember, Andrew, that there was some kind of local, regional, or national sake-related event or competition you were talking about at all? Do you remember what I'm referencing?
Yeah, so super local to St. Louis, there's going to be a sake cocktail competition held at Duckbill. Duckbill's this great little bar run by Meredith Berry down in the Grove neighborhood of St. Louis. If you're ever in town or you live in town, please go. It's fantastic. But they, from what I understand, I'm not involved in the planning of it, so I can't speak too much to the details, but in partnership with the Japanese American Society here in St. Louis, they are doing a cocktail competition where sake has to be the main base ingredient. So that's coming up soon. Another thing to look at is that in spring, we have the Sake and Sakura event at the Garden. Again, something I'm not involved with, unfortunately. Not yet anyways. I'm going to try to change that. But that is a event that they actually do in Japan as well, where once the cherry blossoms start to bloom, the idea is that you go out, you have a little picnic, you eat a little something, you drink a little sake, and you stare at the pretty flowers, which sounds like a great time to me. And then other things that are coming up, I am working with local bars to try to get kind of tap takeovers going on. I'm looking to get some sake on the menu. I believe Sippy, which is a natural wine bar here in St. Louis, I believe that they are about to start doing sake by the glass on the menu. And then, fingers crossed, knock on wood, we'll get get an event rolling with them soon. And then around the country, look out for it, especially if you're in New York or in California or in Miami. In October, on October 1st, there is a global sake day. Sake is historically brewed in the winter season. Refrigeration is super important for any brewing, and when you don't have modern refrigeration, which we didn't until very recently, winter was your refrigeration. So the brewing season for sake starts in October. So the idea nowadays is that we have a big celebration right at the beginning of the brewing season before the brewers are all exhausted and don't want to talk to us. We get to taste a bunch of stuff and have a lot of fun. There's San Francisco. There was one in Asheville, North Carolina last year at Ben's Tune-Up, which is a sake brewery in North Carolina. And then, of course, there's a massive one in New York every year. I think up in Toronto they do one as well. Don't quote me on that one, though. But yeah, so there's tons of events all year round. If you have the luxury of living near a sake-specific store, typically they're doing some kind of tasting right now. I almost guarantee you if you live near a sake store, they're doing a tasting. Mm-hmm. So it's well worth looking into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and also in your local market for the more daring, I remember seeing Andrew in a piece talk about, clearly, again, you go to your Total Wines, preferably your local liquor stores. But here in the St. Louis market, I guess out in kind of the Manchester, Ellisville area, there's what they call the Pan-Asia market. And there, if you're ever looking to do your broader survey course at some of your international grocers in particular, you're probably also going to find like a huge fleet of stuff just because much of the clientele might be more seeking that as opposed to at your other liquor store where it's more incidental for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, too, when we're talking about the retail experience, you know, you really nailed it when you said if you're feeling a little bit braver going out to those Asian grocery stores. Because I love Pan-Asia. It's probably my favorite local Asian market. But when you look at the sake selection, you've got kind of this pitfall of styles that hold up really well unrefrigerated on a shelf sitting right next to a fully unpasteurized sake, which maybe that's good or maybe it's bad.
Right. And unfortunately, either due to language in some cases or lack of knowledge, people in the store might not even be able to tell you. And so...
Almost certainly.
Yeah. So, but here's to the brave people willing to do that. Andrew, we've certainly covered a lot of ground. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you had hoped to cover it all today so far?
I mean, like you said, I think we've kind of covered a lot of ground. We haven't talked about a lot of the specifics, but I would encourage you, there's fantastically written articles that can do a much better job unless we were to sit here for another hour talking about kind of what it is and how it's made and all that stuff. But really, don't be afraid to explore, to splash out. And another thing that I would encourage any listener that is curious about it to do, think beyond Japanese or Asian food when you're thinking sake. One of my favorite pairings is to take a sake and pair it with a tomato-heavy dish because tomato has a ton of umami in there, which complements sake very well. So splash out, think broad, think wide spectrum when you're thinking, what should I be eating with this? There's great sake for, your formal dinner where you've got your friends over and everybody's dressed up in a suit and you're making steaks. There's great sakes for your barbecues, for your Chinese food takeout. You can't go wrong. There's something out there that will pair with anything that you're going to eat.
And I do like that too because, it's so often, wine or other things are paired with dinner and to this idea of, so we will have to, without belaboring it now, we'll see if as we get closer to publication, we can either get some recommendations or if there's a site you can point people to that could also have any of that. But I like that idea of starting out that from a culinary standpoint too. So
yeah, and I'll say this too: if you're ever standing in a store and you're staring at a wall of sake and you're like, I have no idea, you're more than welcome to go to my Instagram page and just, the DMs are open. Shoot me a picture of that shelf. And assuming I'm not crazy busy, I am happy to tell you what I think would be good off of that shelf.
And is that Lamb Dog? Is that right?
Like Snoop Dogg, yeah. Lamb Dog, D-O-double-G.
Okay, man.
Or you can go to Highwater Sake, at Highwater Sake on Instagram.
I didn't know I had the second D-O-double-G.
The second D-O-double-G.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
He's here in the building. Andrew, this is great. Thank you for this. So much fun. And the sake is delightful, so thank you.
I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Cool. All right, we're out of here.
Yep. Kanpai.
Kanpai. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter. Or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.